so stay tuned.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Palantir's financials. We've covered a lot of ground already, but now let's shift our focus a bit and think about, what does all this mean for you if you're considering investing in Palantir?
Yeah, let's talk money. So Palantir announced this stock buyback program last year, authorizing up to $1 billion in repurchases. What's the signal here? Are they just betting on themselves? Or is there something else going on?
Yeah, stock buyback programs, they can be interpreted in many ways. On the one hand, it can be seen as a signal that the company believes their stock is undervalued and that, it's a good investment. It can be a way to return value to shareholders, boost earnings per share. But on the other hand, it's important to remember that, a buyback authorization doesn't obligate them to buy back any specific number of shares. They have flexibility in how and when they execute the program.
So it's a potential sign of confidence, but it's not a guarantee. It's more like setting aside a pool of money that they can use strategically, if the opportunity arises.
Exactly. And speaking of strategic moves, let's talk about their inclusion in the S&P 500 this year. That's a major milestone for any company. But you have to wonder what it means for a company like Palantir, which, has often operated a bit outside of the mainstream.
Yeah, it definitely brings a certain level of prestige and visibility, which can attract a broader range of investors. But it also comes with higher expectations, right? They're now under the microscope. And they need to perform consistently at a high level to maintain their position in this elite index.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. Inclusion in the S&P 500 is kind of a double-edged sword. It can boost their profile, but it also puts them under greater scrutiny. Investors will be watching their quarterly results even more closely. And, any missteps could have a more significant impact on their stock price.
So increased visibility, but also increased pressure to deliver. Makes sense. Okay, let's dive into something that I think might concern some investors. Their multi-class stock structure is a bit unusual, isn't it?
You're talking about their Class A, B, and F shares. Yeah, it's this structure that grants significant control to the founders, which might raise some eyebrows among investors who value, shareholder influence. Essentially, the founders hold shares that give them more voting power than regular investors.
So that's an important point to consider. I mean, on one hand, you could argue that the founders' vision and leadership have been instrumental to Palantir's success. But it also raises questions about potential conflicts of interest and, the long-term impact on shareholder value. How much power is too much power?
It's a trade-off that investors need to weigh carefully. It really comes down to how much faith you have in the founder's long-term vision for the company.
Another factor to consider when evaluating Palantir as a potential investment. And we can't ignore, the inherent volatility of the stock market, especially for a tech company like Palantir.
Yeah, the tech sector, with its rapid innovation and constant disruption, is known for its stock price swings. Investors need to be prepared for a roller coaster ride. They have to be comfortable with both the potential for gains and losses in this kind of dynamic environment.
Especially with a company like Palantir, which seems to generate some pretty strong opinions on both sides. Some people love them, others are deeply skeptical. And that kind of division can really fuel volatility. Yeah, as we've seen with other tech companies.
Yeah, exactly. And the filings also highlight the prevalence of litigation in the tech sector. Companies like Palantir are operating in such a sensitive area. They're often the target of lawsuits, which can be, costly and distracting, even if they're ultimately successful.
So another layer of risk to consider. So far, we've covered, the financial highlights, the growth drivers, the risks, the investor perspective. But what about the people behind the numbers? The filings also included some pretty interesting insights about Palantir's workforce and company culture. What stood out to you?
Yeah, I think employee insights are often overlooked in kind of the traditional financial analysis, but they're crucial for understanding a company's long-term sustainability. You can have the best technology in the world, but if you can't attract and retain top talent, it's all for naught. And Palantir is operating in this, fiercely competitive market for talent.
It's a war for talent out there.
Yeah.
Especially in the tech sector. Everyone's fighting tooth and nail for, the best engineers, data scientists, sales professionals. It's cutthroat. So how is Palantir faring in this battle for talent?
Well, they're facing the same challenges as everyone else. The filings acknowledge the difficulty of hiring and retaining qualified personnel, especially when you're competing with companies that offer, more established career paths, maybe even more appealing perks.
Now, Palantir is not exactly known for being, your typical Silicon Valley company. Their culture is a bit different, maybe even a little more intense. Does that affect their ability to attract and retain employees?
I think it's certainly a factor. Some people thrive in that kind of environment. Others find it a bit too much. And their unique sales model, involving these highly complex data analytics and lengthy sales cycles, requires a very specialized sales force and extensive training. It's not easy to find people with the right skill set.
Yeah, it sounds like their sales team is made up of more, consultants than traditional salespeople. They have to be experts in both the technology and the client's specific needs.
Exactly. And it takes time and investment to build a high-performing sales team like that, which could potentially slow their revenue growth in the short term as they ramp up their hiring and training efforts.
It's always that classic growth dilemma. You need to invest in talent to scale, but that investment can impact your bottom line in the short term. And then there's the issue of stock-based compensation, which we touched on earlier. It seems like they rely pretty heavily on this approach to motivate employees.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, as we discussed before. Stock-based compensation can be a really powerful tool to align employee and shareholder interests. It gives employees a stake in the company's success and incentivizes them to drive growth and profitability.
But it also comes with that potential for dilution,
Yeah,
right? If they're constantly issuing new shares to employees, it can dilute the value of existing shares.
precisely. So it's about finding the right balance. Investors need to weigh the potential benefits of having a motivated workforce against the potential impact of dilution.
It seems like every aspect of Palantir's financial picture has these nuances and trade-offs that investors need to carefully consider. There are no easy answers.
Yeah, that's a great observation. There's no magic formula when evaluating a company as complex and multifaceted as Palantir. It's about understanding the various moving parts, how they fit together, and how they might impact the company's future.
And that's why we do these deep dives. We're here to help you unpack the complexity and make sense of it all. But we're not just looking at the numbers. We're trying to understand the story behind the numbers. We've talked about their financials, their growth drivers, their risks, their workforce. But there's another layer to this story, a layer that surrounds Palantir like a fog, a layer that I think we need to address, and that's their reputation.
You're absolutely right. Palantir has a somewhat controversial reputation. Some people see them as this vital tool for national security and intelligence gathering. Others see them as a threat to privacy and civil liberties. Their technology is incredibly powerful, and how that technology is used and by whom is a question that looms large.
So how does their move into the commercial sector affect this perception? Does it change the narrative? Or does it just add another dimension to an already complex story? We'll explore this further in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.